Yeah, my name is Richard STEIN. I'm Global Head of Software Development and Lifecycle at Goldman Sachs. And with me today is Michael Su, who leads our Secure Supply Chain initiative. So SDLC at Goldman's basically means we're accountable for keeping thousands of engineers productive, regulated, and secure. Now, increasingly, secure is as much about securing the inputs to the software development process as it is about secure coding practices or testing the output. And for many vendor stacks and tool chains, there's a lot of emphasis placed on SBOM, or software bill of materials, as a key part of the secure supply chain puzzle. So a manifest is certainly a useful thing. But today what we want to do is talk about how that is a step, but only a step, in thinking about your secure supply chain. Not so good for standing in front of. So we've all evolved as software engineers in a world where open source has been a huge boon to our personal productivity and our team productivity. And we've all evolved in a world where sharing of code is very commonplace. But with the attack vectors that have also now evolved with us, we have to think about what is in our software. Now, many examples in the public domain where security researchers have effectively used supply chain subversion, which is a deliberate abuse of namespaces on public open source repositories, to inject code into the supply chains of some of the most important companies and software stacks in the world. So this is far from a hypothetical problem. Beyond that, you see very motivated and organized actors conducting multi-year initiatives where they attack the chain of trust at a human level within the crowdsourcing model inherent in open source. And we don't have time today to review any deep case studies, but if you haven't read about the most recent XZ attack and how close that came to infiltrating pretty much every Linux distribution on the planet, it's a chilling example of how real this attack vector is. So, should my build process emit a manifest, as many do today? Absolutely. Should I ensure all my inputs have a manifest? Absolutely. However, the methodology behind how that manifest came into existence and the sanctity of your build process and what that emits are key. If the manifest itself is a product of a flawed process, be that within your SDLC or that of your open source supplier or vendor, then it's not really worth the bytes it consumes on your hard drive. So Mike will now take you through some of the flawed assumptions and practical pitfalls of the SBOM ecosystem.
Hi. So, first consideration is, where did your SBOM come from? It's likely you will have received an SBOM from the outside world, perhaps for open source or vendor-provided software. But why should you trust the claims that are in that bill of materials? It's essentially a self-attested document. You would not trust a JWT that had no signature block. So why should you trust the claims in an unvalidated SBOM? Unless you have some means of mechanically verifying the information that's in the SBOM, you probably shouldn't take it at face value. Hello? Okay. Conversely, if you are generating an SBOM yourself, perhaps from your build process, it's likely that you'll be using some build tooling within the build. But you should be aware that you are implicitly trusting the tooling and trusting the build. If you are relying on that SBOM to record information about the build that you're going to use later for verification, if the build was compromised, the SBOM is going to be compromised as well. And so, again, you need to think about the implications. And again, when it comes to things that you don't have an SBOM for, where you're having to generate an SBOM after the fact, for example, artifacts you received that didn't come with an SBOM, and you're having to use, say, software composition analysis to produce one. There are limits to that technique. Things that were present at build time but are not in the distributed artifact, it's impossible to know anything about them from scanning the final binary. Okay, and then a bit of a quiz. So, given no declared dependencies, how many dependencies do you think this Maven project has? And the actual answer is close to 100, surprisingly. So all of the build tooling has its own dependencies. And when you run a Maven build, you're pulling in all of these things that you may not realize you're pulling in. So the next question is, what is your SBOM missing? Is your SBOM capturing the build tooling? Is your SBOM capturing the build runtime? What else was present at build time that could have modified the build? Particularly if you are using shared build infrastructure. it's very common to deliberately exclude build tooling from an SBOM, but you have to consider that the build tooling literally is running your build. It could modify the source, so you should definitely care about it. Oops. And then, as a segue back into the wider topic, what are you going to do with your SBOM after it's been generated? There's no point generating an SBOM and then just sticking it in a filing cabinet and forgetting about it. You need to be able to efficiently query those SBOMs such that you can make intelligent decisions based on the information contained within. And if you care about the artifacts they're describing, you should care about the SBOMs as well. You need to worry about if the SBOMs have been tampered with too. And with that, I will hand back to Richard.
Thank you. So we obviously don't have the time to do a step-by-step deep dive into all the factors it takes to build a modern SDLC, and certainly not one that adheres to all the best practices within a secure supply chain. However, we can try and hit upon some salient factors. And as Mike just alluded to, it's all about the end-to-end. And I'll start specifically referring to that more as the chain of trust. So next slide. So how do you build a chain of trust? So crowdsourced open source is obviously an attack vector, but more simply than that, are you even ingesting the open source that you think you are? Are you building from source, where that's an option, which it always is not always, so that you can be certain of its transitive dependency graph? If you aren't building from source, are you even cross-checking the checksums so it matches the official build? With so many redistribution hubs and caches in our modern build tooling, or implicit in our modern build tooling, and the opportunities for typo squatting and injection at every stage, ensuring the provenance of even pre-built binaries is an essential step. And then how you build things matters. If your build environment is cache polluted or has arbitrary access to network resources, if it is not what I would call sealed meaningfully, then you have no guarantees of what is being built, and you don't have the guarantee of hermetic rebuilds. This means you can't even reliably recreate your production estate, which goes well beyond supply chain. And as many of these best practice recommendations do, one might argue that a good secure supply chain is actually the symptom of a healthy modern build system. And so then finally, how are you locking down, hopefully via cryptographic hash, digest, or similar, the output of your sealed builds? And how are you ensuring that those are the binaries that are actually gated into production without mutation? So test execution, deployment, none of these things should be touching what you built hermetically, and you should be maintaining that chain of trust. Yeah. So, trust for ingest, build, test, and deploy. All these things should be forming a known input and output chain with guarded provenance at every step. So done correctly, your SBOM manifest data should be a critical part of that audit trail that proves the validity of your chain and gives you trust in your deployable artifacts. But without the chain, it's just a self-assertion of an unknown state, which is Mike's opening point. You know, the difference between a useful SBOM is one that actually evidences and documents this chain of trust, and not one that simply is a self-assertion that came along with a jar file. So to recap, any chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So we often talk, as the picture shows, about a gate without a fence. Your chain of trust is that fence, and only then can you start thinking about gates and ultimately the policies that you need to go along with them. So the outcome you're looking for is certainty that your production estate contains a known set of unmutated artifacts, and should you decide that an input is suspect or known bad in the case of CVEs and other known vulnerability signals that we all receive as developers, then you know how your estate is impacted, and you should be able to quickly run the correct sealed pipelines to cycle those unwanted artifacts out of your estate. So this is very much a pragmatic outcome you're looking for. The bill of materials is meant to represent that pragmatic chain and not simply be, as Mike said, something you put in a filing cabinet and ignore forever. It's meant to be part of your provenance and your gating. So obviously we've been talking at a fairly abstract and conceptual level, and we don't have time for a full review of the state of solutions in this space, but I do want to leave you with some pointers into the right directions. So there are some build tools, such as Bazel, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, that force very well-known input sets and correctly assume that the build chain itself forms part of the hermetic guarantee, which many systems, including SaaS-type CI/CD products, miss. But adopting a new packaging and build system can be a very high bar, especially when you're working on what might be considered lower-risk application stacks. So, however, there are simpler approaches. So even containerized build images, you have to think about the chain of trust. So that means network isolation on your build runners for everything you don't have provenance for. And really, this should mean that you only have artifact stores and code repositories accessible to that critical build step with a meaningful ingest policy that cross-checks all the input hashes, as I described earlier. So you want to be stamping everything you output to differentiate it as something you produce so you can trust it. And then again, use cryptographic hashes to preventing that unwanted mutation. Standards are useful. I think what I often find surprising is how nascent this entire problem statement is for the world, even though we all face it. So there are some useful standards, and you can't possibly police every vendor or open source project that you consume today, which I'm sure for most of you measures in the thousands. And you may choose to narrow that scope in the future to make that risk more manageable. But medium term, you need to think about what is the quality bar that you're holding your external dependencies to for ingest. And there are standards such as SALSA, which is part of a Google initiative, which starts to give us a bar we can measure each other to and even conduct audits to. And I think that will become more and more part of the norm as this problem becomes more well known at a regulatory level. And then we can start to audit the generation of the people's build chains and start to understand whether or not the attestation they're giving you in the form of an SBOM is actually worthwhile or something you can trust. And then finally, and probably the most important piece, is how you think about runtime protection. So if I have only one strong piece of advice, it's this. Think about things, if you're using containers, immutable containers with binary auth is a very, very meaningful kind of outcome of a hermetic build chain that can start to actually allow you to reason about your runtime estate. And a container itself is just an artifact, and it should be the accumulation of all the manifest of its input set and ultimately be protected from mutation itself. So container runtimes certainly have their issues, but they represent a far easier system to reason about than just VM images or bare metal. So I guess last slide. So conclusion. This is a very big problem, secure supply chain. It's not going away. I think the industry is responding with standards, both for the manifests themselves and also how builds are created, so that we can trust things that were done outside of our immediate purview. But again, this is very much early days, and things are only just maturing. And we have to educate ourselves on those standards and be very selective about which ones we value. And ultimately, unless you have access to the source code all the way down the chain to the bottom of the transitive graph, then you have to trust something. And obviously, that's a hard problem to scale to for many. So there will always be a trade-off of security versus certainty and the practicality of building software and leveraging open source. So while you may not be able to get ironclad guarantees about what you ingest, you can certainly ensure that your own build chain has meaningful definition and defense. And you can reason about what your manifest data does and doesn't mean. And then you can start to reason about how you want to define and limit the risk of your input set. So, please do feel reach out to us on public forums if this is a topic you find of interest and want to continue discussing. It's a very big topic, and we couldn't really do it justice today, but I hope you found that useful. Thank you.